Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is Part 1, Chapter 7. Resting at home after his exhausting VFW tour, which had included emotionally draining visits to the casualties hidden away in 18 veterans' hospitals, Butler received a phone call from a familiar voice. Jerry Maguire insisted that he had to see the general immediately because he had, quote, something of the utmost importance, end quote, to impart. Butler and his wife had planned to drive into Philadelphia that afternoon, so, curiosity aroused, he agreed to meet Maguire at the Bellevue Hotel. It was August 22nd, 1934, 3 days after a German plebiscite had approved vesting sole executive power in Adolf Hitler as Führer of Nazi Germany. Shortly before 3 o'clock, Butler entered the empty hotel lobby, where he found the pudgy bond salesman waiting for him. Maguire wrung his hands enthusiastically, as though they were long-lost comrades from Butler's old 4th Battalion in Panama. Leading the way to the rear of the lobby, Maguire took him into the hotel's empty restaurant, which was not operating for the summer. They took a table in a secluded corner of the room, and Maguire began describing how enjoyable his trip to Europe had been. Butler patiently waited for him to get down to business. He wondered, not without sympathy, whether it was the silver plate in Maguire's head that made him so prolix. Maguire finally asked whether the general planned to attend the forthcoming American Legion convention in Miami. Butler replied curtly that he did not. He felt irritated by Maguire's arrogant assumption that the stale scheme of using the Legion for his gold clicks propaganda was a matter of the, quote, utmost importance, end quote, to Butler. Maguire then insinuated that it was time to, quote, get the soldiers together, end quote. Butler agreed grimly, but his cryptic tone, he was sure, implied a considerably different purpose for organizing the veterans than Maguire had in mind. Maguire revealed that he had been up to the continent during the previous 7 months. His backers had sent him abroad to study the role of veterans organizations had played in working for and bringing about dictatorships. In Italy, Maguire found that Mussolini's real power stemmed from veterans organization organized in his black shirts. They had made him dictator and were chief protectors of his regime. Beginning to suspect what Maguire had in mind, Butler tried to seem matter-of-fact as he asked whether Maguire thought Mussolini's form of government was a good example for American veterans to work toward. Maguire didn't think so. His investigations on the continent, he revealed, had convinced him that neither Mussolini nor Hitler, nor the kind of paramilitary organizations they had built, could be made attractive to the American veteran. But he had discovered an organization that could be, he revealed in elation. He'd been in France during a national crisis brought about by nationwide wage slashes. Riots had erupted in Paris early in February, ending in the calling of general strike that had paralyzed the country. Civil war had been averted only by the formation of a national union ministry made up of all parties except socialists, communists, and royalists. A key role in ending the crisis had been played by the right-wing veterans organization called the Croix de Foix. It was a super-organization, Maguire explained, an amalgamation of all other French veteran organizations, and was composed of officers and non-coms. The Croix de Foix had 500,000 members, and each was a leader of 10 others, and their voting strength amounted to 5 million. It occurred to Butler that if Maguire's description was accurate, the Croix de Foix was an elitist outfit minus the democratic voice of the greatest majority of veterans, the buck privates, who were expected only to follow and obey, exactly as they'd been ordered to do in wartime. Maguire now told Butler that his group planned to build an American version of the Croix de Foix. Asked its purpose, the fat man hesitated, then replied that it was intended to, quote, support, unquote, the president. Butler asked Riley why Roosevelt should need the support of 500,000 super soldiers when he had the whole American people behind him. Looking petulant and impatient, Maguire ignored the question, pointing out that the crux of the matter was Roosevelt's dilemma in not having enough money to finance the New Deal, and the danger that he might disrupt the American system of finance to get it. Maguire and his group were firmly determined that the president would not be allowed to do it. Despite Maguire's exasperating circumlocution and the twists in his logic, a fresh pattern was becoming clear to Butler. Far from, quote, supporting, unquote, Franklin Roosevelt, Maguire and his interest behind him were obviously planning to compel the president to yield to their demands about American finances. The American version of the Croix de Foix was intended to only be a powerful paramilitary organization to enforce those demands. But when Butler pressed him on its purpose, Maguire denied emphatically any intention to frighten the president. In fact, he explained, the whole idea was really to support and help Roosevelt, who was obviously overworked, by providing him with, quote, an assistant president, unquote, to take details of office off his shoulders. It was quite constitutional, Maguire insisted. The aide would be called the Secretary of General Affairs. According to Maguire, the president himself had been grooming an aide for such a role. General Hugh S. Johnson, a controversial administrator of the National Recovery Administration. But Maguire confided Johnson had been too loose-lipped to suit Roosevelt, and as a result was slated to be fired within 3 or 4 weeks. Pressed to explain how he acquired this information, MacArthur assured Butler that his group was close to the White House and had advanced information on all such secret matters. Confused, Butler didn't know quite what to make of these oddly faceted revelations. But he was subsequently reminded of Maguire's prediction when Johnson resigned in pique from the administration soon afterward and began attacking Roosevelt and the New Deal in the syndicated column for the Scrip Howard Press. Butler did not have to feign new interest in Maguire's proposals. Obviously, much more was now involved than simply lobbying efforts for restoration of the gold standard. Maguire, interpreting the general's absorption as an omen of cooperation, grew more candid about the plan of his group. They would work up public sympathy for the overburdened president. You good? He explained eagerly by campaign, explaining that Roosevelt's health was failing. The dumb public would accept the need to give him relief by having a cabinet official take the chores of patronage and other routine worries off of the office of his shoulders. Then the president's status would become like that of the president of France, a ceremonial figurehead, while the Secretary of General Affairs for the country ran the country. Time out, you little bugger. Okay. Sorry, little Leon is precocious. Thus, at one stroke, the country would be rid of Roosevelt's misrule and would be put back on the gold standard. And now, Maguire concluded triumphantly, how did the general feel about heading the new super-organization that would be the power behind bringing about these sweeping changes? Unable to contain himself any longer, Butler exploded that if McGuire and his backers tried to mount a fascist putsch, he would raise another army of 500,000 veterans to oppose them, and the nation would be plunged into a new civil war. Upset, McGuire hastily assured the general that he and his group had no such intentions, but only sought to ease the burdens of the presidency. Butler sarcastically expressed doubt that Roosevelt would appreciate their concern and turn his executive power over to their Secretary of General Affairs while limiting himself to ceremonial functions. Besides, Butler pointed out tersely, any attempt to build a huge paramilitary arm of 500,000 men would require enormous funds. McGuire revealed that he now had $3 million in working funds and could get $300 million if it were needed. He added that in about a year, Butler would be able to assemble 500,000 veterans with the expectation that such a show of force would enable the movement to gain control of the government peacefully in just a few days. Butler was stunned. Either McGuire was a madman, psychotic, or fantastic liar, or what he was describing was a treasonous plot to end democracy in the United States. He demanded to know who was going to put up all that money. McGuire replied that Clark was good for $15 million, and that the rest would come from the same people who had financed, quote, the Chicago propaganda, end quote, about the gold standard of the American Legion Convention, and who were now behind the planned march on Washington. What plans, Butler wanted to know, did they have to take care of the veterans? The superorganization, McGuire said, would pay privates $10 and captains $35 a month for 1 year. After that, it would no longer be necessary. But how did the plotters manage the legal aspects of setting up an assistant president of the White House? McGuire explained that the president could be induced to resign because of bad health. Vice President Nance Garner, who didn't want to be president, would refuse the office. By the rule of succession, January of State Cordell Hull was next in line, but he was far too old and could easily be set aside to make way for a Secretary of General Affairs to take Roosevelt's place as president. McGuire again urged Butler to head the paramilitary army. The scale of the plot, as it was unfolding to him, took Butler's breath away. It occurred to him now that McGuire's backers had been contemplating the creation of a fascist veterans army at the time McGuire had first approached him to, quote, get the soldiers together, end quote, behind their gold standard campaign. That explained why McGuire wooed him so persistently, despite the general's obvious reluctance and outbursts of temper when patriotic indignation overcame his attempts to play along and learn what the plotters were up to. No false modesty prevented Butler from recognizing that he was perhaps the best known and certainly the most popular and charismatic military figure in the United States. He also suited the plotters' plans perfectly because he was noted for a brilliant, hard-hitting style of oratory that, they undoubtedly reasoned, could be put to the service of demagoguery in the same spellbinding way Hitler and Mussolini had magnetized millions into following him. His rasping voice and fiery spirit captured audiences and held them hypnotized. His reputation for fearless honesty, for speaking his mind bluntly no matter whose corns he tread on, and also made him the ideal candidate to sell the plotters' propaganda to the nation's veterans, if he could be persuaded to view their scheme as ultra-patriotic. A combination of these reasons had unquestionably inspired Jerry Maguire's insistent campaign to win him as the head of the putsch. It explained why McGuire had refused to take no for an answer, counting on his persuasive powers as a bond salesman to break down Butler's sales resistance by camouflaging the raw nature of the conspiracy and tempting him into the plot with the biggest bribe he ever offered to any American, the opportunity to become the first dictator of the United States. In a word, McGuire was convinced that with Smedley Butler as their man in the White House, on the white horse, the man on the white horse, the plotters would have their greatest chance of success. Increasingly uneasy and on guard, Butler now resolved to play along carefully until he had penetrated the full secret blueprint of the conspiracy. Keeping his voice cordial, he expressed interest in McGuire's scheme, but exhibited enough doubts to induce him to reveal more in the effort to reassure Butler and win him over. Butler became convinced that if McGuire was telling the truth, far richer and far more powerful men than just Robert S. Clark had to be involved. Clark had told Butler that he had been willing to spend $15 million of his fortune in the plotters' schemes to restore the gold standard, but McGuire had revealed that the people behind him could, and would if necessary, raise $300 million for the putsch. Butler determined to find out who they were. He demanded assurances from McGuire that reputable and important people were really behind the plan to create an American croix de foi, pointing out that he could not afford to risk his reputation by getting involved at any second-rate adventure. Convinced that at last he was on the verge of winning the general's support, McGuire eagerly sought to impress him with the caliber of the influential movers and shakers of America who were involved in the plot. He revealed that in Paris he had made his headquarters at the offices of Morgan and Hodges. Butler tried to conceal his astonishment. There was only one Morgan in the financial world, J.P. Morgan and Company. McGuire left no doubt in his mind that the nation's biggest financiers were, indeed, involved. According to the bond salesman, there had been a meeting in Paris to decide upon the selection of the man to head the superorganization. McGuire and his group had held out for Butler, but the Morgan interest distrusted the general as, quote, too radical, unquote, preferring Douglas MacArthur instead. MacArthur's term as chief of staff expired in November, and the Morgan interest felt that if Roosevelt failed to reappoint him, he would be bitter enough to accept their offer. Butler observed that MacArthur would be likely to have difficulty in lining up veterans behind him because of his dispersion of the bonus army had made him highly unpopular. McGuire indicated that the Morgan Cote's second choice was Hanford McNider, an Iowa manufacturer who was a former commander of the American Legion. But McGuire emphasized that his own group was still insisting that Butler was the only military leader in the country capable of rallying the veterans behind him. The Morgan interests had acknowledged Butler's immense prestige and popularity, he revealed, but were apprehensive that as head of the paramilitary force, Butler might lead it in the wrong direction. Butler observed that McNider would have no more popular appeal than MacArthur because he had gone on record as opposing the bonus. McGuire then revealed that McNider would be cued to change his stand and would do so. Butler remembered this prediction when 3 weeks later McNider suddenly reversed his position and came out in support of the bonus. If Butler could not be persuaded to head the new superorganization, McGuire said, the offer would definitely be made to MacArthur, whether or not the latter was reappointed chief of staff. He confided that there would be an administration fight over MacArthur's reappointment, but he would get it because he was the son-in-law of Philadelphian Edward T. Stotesbury, a Morgan partner. It was a bold prediction, since never before in American history had a chief of staff been allowed to succeed himself. Butler was all the more startled and impressed with McGuire's sources of information when his prediction became true several months later. McGuire also informed Butler that James Van Zandt, the national commander of the VFW, would be one of those asked to serve as leader of the new superorganization. He would be approached by one of McGuire's envoys at the forthcoming VFW convention in Louisville, Kentucky. Butler asked when the new superorganization would surface and begin functioning, and what it would be called. McGuire said that he didn't know the name of it yet, but that the press would announce its formation in 2 or 3 weeks, and that the roster of its founders would include some of the most important men in America. One of them, McGuire revealed, would be none other than former New York Governor Al Smith, who had lost the 1928 presidential race to Hoover as the candidate of the Democratic Party. Butler raised his bushy eyebrows in astonishment. It seemed incredible that the derby-hatted happy warrior who had grown up in New York's East Side slums could be involved in a fascist plot backed by wealthy men. But he knew that Smith was now a business associate of the powerful DuPont family who had cultivated him through DuPont official John J. Raskob, the former chairman of the Democratic Party. Under their influence, Smith had grown more and more politically conservative following his defeat, while still remaining a Democrat. Could it be possible that a leading standard-bearer of the Democrats was committed to help overthrow the chief Democrat in the White House? In slight shock, Butler asked McGuire why Smith was involved. McGuire replied that Smith had decided to break with the Roosevelt administration and was preparing a public blast against it, which would be published in about a month. Pressed for more information about the new superorganization, McGuire told Butler that it would be described publicly as a society, quote, to maintain the Constitution, end quote. Butler observed dryly that the Constitution did not seem to be in any grave danger. Then he bluntly asked what McGuire's stake was in the enterprise. McGuire shrugged that he was a businessman, and besides, he, his wife, and his children had enjoyed a long, expensive stay in Europe, courtesy of his backers. Taking his leave, McGuire said that he was going to Miami to agitate again for the gold standard, as well as to get the new paramilitary organization rolling. He promised to contact Butler again after the Legion convention. After he had gone, the bemused general was almost tempted to dismiss the whole plot as the product of a disordered imagination, his or McGuire's, but a grim sense of foreboding told him that he was in the eye of a gathering storm.